These men have spent over $1 million, and they've suffered immensely. Their families have suffered. And what does this tell the rest of the citizenry of our state? Is that if you go against the government narrative, they will crush you. One way or another. They'll incarcerate you, they'll bankrupt you. It doesn't matter whether you're innocent or guilty,
Pretrial proceedings ended today for Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenek, the two remaining defendants from the original Coutts 4. Robert Kraychik reporting for Rebel News here in Lethbridge, Alberta, in front of the city's courthouse. Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenek are both being charged with conspiracy to murder. They are accused of having conspired to murder RCMP officers in the context of their participation in the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade, a peaceful protest that was civilly disobedient that ran alongside the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, Ontario of the same year. The two protests were broadly opposed to this entire so-called public health apparatus built upon COVID-19. You all remember it. It came with mandates, edicts, orders issued by all levels of government. Chris Lysak and Jerry Morin, two of the original Coutts 4, pled out to lesser charges. Given that pretrial proceedings concluded this morning, the proper trial begins tomorrow. The jury was selected this past Friday, and they'll be brought in tomorrow at 10 in the morning Mountain Time when the proceedings begin. Now, pretrial proceedings are still under publication ban and will remain so until the trial's conclusion, which means until the jury renders its verdict. The pretrial proceedings in general are where the rules of the game are disputed and established between the competing parties, the Crown and the defense teams. So, for example, consider evidentiary disputes. Perhaps the prosecution seeks to introduce some evidence, and the defense teams want to contest the admissibility of that evidence in the trial on the grounds of either its veracity and trustworthiness or its legitimacy of acquisition. So while there may be evidence that's introduced in the context of a pretrial that gets rejected by the judge in terms of its admissibility, in order to protect the jurors from having their minds contaminated by having access to information that they should not have had access to, the publication ban remains in effect across the entirety of the trial's proceedings. Because if I were to report on it, or if someone else were to report on it, it still could enter the minds of the jurors in one way or another and color them in a way that they were not supposed to be colored, given that they were not meant to ever have access to that information in the first place. Now, trial dates have been ostensibly scheduled until the end of July. It doesn't mean the trial will take that long, but that's how much availability is currently there for proceedings to continue if needed. So I'm here with Kim. Kim, fair to say you're an interested citizen from Ontario?
Yes, I'm very interested in this case. I think that there's grave injustice being done here. And I believe that these men are basically being, were framed from the beginning to have justification for the invocation of the Emergencies Act, otherwise known as the War Measures Act, to crush the dissident opinions.
One detail I want to share with you folks about a courtroom policy restriction on note-taking is that digital devices are not permitted inside the courtroom. You're not allowed to bring in a cell phone, a laptop, a tablet. There is an exception granted to accredited media, a group to which I belong because I've gone through this accreditation process with the courthouse. But for interested citizens, ordinary persons who wish to observe proceedings, which is ostensibly a public institution, they're not allowed to bring in anything but pencil, pen, and paper. And in 2024, the conventional way through which most people take notes is through some digital device. That's how people write things down. For me, if I was not permitted to bring in my mobile phone, my digital devices, I would have a massive struggle doing my job, given that we operate digitally. So if I'm taking notes down with pen and pencil, I've got to then convert it over to digital format. That would be very, very cumbersome. It would also be a lot less specific because digital devices, for me, are more precise and more speedy in terms of aggregating information. So keep that in mind when you consider that the judiciary, the judicial system, these courts have a moral obligation to maintain public transparency, given that they are public institutions. But yet in this case, they're still operating in what I would describe as an archaic way at best and an abusive way at worst in terms of this prohibition against digital devices, which are the standard for note-taking in the modern era.
These men have spent over $1 million, and they've suffered immensely. Their families have suffered. And what does this tell the rest of the citizenry of our state? Is that if you go against the government narrative, they will crush you. One way or another. They'll incarcerate you, they'll bankrupt you. It doesn't matter whether you're innocent or guilty. Can you imagine if these men had a fine of $1 million? I mean, basically, they've had that, and in addition to their freedom being lost, and basically, from what I'm hearing, their incarceration was somewhat, inhumane. The detention facility is not meant for long-term incarceration.
Given that we don't take federal government handouts, unlike the so-called mainstream media, the establishment media outlets out there, we're genuinely independent, and we're only able to be that way because of donations from our dear audience. So if you folks value this sort of in-the-field original journalism that you're not going to get anywhere else, because only Rebel News can deliver it to you, please help us continue this operation. Visit truckertrials.com, contribute what you can, and also stay up to date with our ongoing coverage of this trial.